Well, thank you very much, and thank you everybody for turning up. And essentially, this is pretty much all the people that I know in my life in Ireland, and I'm very grateful for you for turning up. I've done one of these before, and David said, people think it's interesting to hear about how you came to write the book, and I'm sure I've told you all these stories all before, but too bad, I'm going to tell them all again. So really, the book, I ended up in Prague about 10 years ago, and essentially what happened 10 years ago was I was living in Sydney, and I had a job as a mid-level university administrator, as Angela has just said, and it was a sort of ordinary and, relatively well-ordered life. I mean, there was nothing to complain about. I didn't have a husband and I didn't have a child, but I wasn't going to die of starvation anytime soon. But you know what it is, around about 10 years ago, 40 arrived. And for those of you who've reached 40, you know that you get to 40 and you look around and you go, oh yeah, that's right, this is going to end, isn't it, in about this amount of time later. And you look around and you think, funny, when I started out around about 16, pretty much what I had in mind was, world famous actress, princess, wealthy. I kind of wasn't expecting to look around and see university administrator, cat. That's right, mid-level. I know. Not even very successful. So, sort of luckily for me, at that moment, although I had not managed to have a husband or kids, that turned out to be quite a good thing, because I was able at that moment then to just go, well, the thing that I'd always wanted to do, I suppose, was to write and to travel and to live somewhere else. And I was able just to drop my life on its head and head over to Prague. I'd considered Paris, of course, because all the best romantic books about living overseas are written about Paris. And I took one look at Paris and thought, that looks expensive and difficult, won't be going there. So I ended up in Prague. And for those of you who like the genre, and I like the genre, the sort of memoir and the travel genre and everything, it's fantastically kind of romantic, isn't it? I mean, no matter what happens, you leave your dull life and you end up meeting the man of your life, discovering your inner self, generally having a sort of marvellous and sunlit time. And when I turned up in Prague, for about the first 2 months, I did have a marvellous and sunlit time. I have to say, it was loads of fun. I was in Europe. It was a beautiful cobblestoned city. There were fairy tale castles everywhere. There were all these sort of exotic people around sort of drinking beer and eating sausage, and I flung myself into it free, absolutely free. And then after about 2 months, midlife hit again, because, fairy tale castles are all very well, but there was the small matter of eating and earning a living and all those other things. And so rather an interesting thing happened to me. Actually, instead of living this unbelievable romantic life, what I ended up living was the life of an immigrant. And that is an altogether different thing, and particularly if you're living somewhere where you don't speak the language. And so my life instead began a bit of a sort of, in most respects, downward spiral. The handsome prince, certainly never eventuated in Prague, but nor did anything sort of remotely looking like a decent job. And my jobs got sort of worse and worse and worse, and I began to experience what it's like to be vulnerable, really vulnerable, I would be sacked on the spot and lose weeks and weeks and weeks of wages, and where in Australia I might have turned round and called my lawyer and done something about it, in Prague, when you can't speak the language and you haven't got a visa and you're basically, nothing, you just go, oh, well, I guess I'll just get another job then and leave quietly without making a fuss. So the first job I got, I was working in a hotel as a web writer, and that was quite fun, and then I got sacked from that. No fault of mine, I was a brilliant web writer, but, he was nuts. And then the jobs after that got more and more sort of bizarre and absurd, until finally one day the second last job I had, I was a hat check girl, and I was working in a gallery, and I was with my friend Susie, and Susie, in her life before this life that we had both chosen, Susie had had quite a good career in the American military. So here we were in this gallery with all these people coming in, chucking their fur coats at us, and I was staggering under fur coats and chucking them over to Susie as she was hanging them up, and I looked over at Susie and I said, "You know, I've got a degree." And Susie said, "Why don't you just stab me in the heart?" And I think from that moment, both of us began to think, yeah, we've probably had enough of this now. And my very last job, I was working as a fairy in a Christmas children's gathering, and the very last thing I can recall of working in Prague was wearing this sort of red velvet hat with blinking lights and with sort of tiny, sweaty, screaming children hanging onto each hand, and just thinking, you know, I think it's time for me to return to the first world. And so I did, in fact, go to England after that, where in fact in Sheffield, of all places, I met the love of my life, sitting here in the front row. Hello, darling. Not you. And I went back to the life of a university administrator, and a very strange thing happened, you know. Having left this so-called kind of romantic period, I can remember for quite some time, and I'm talking years, when I would arrive in the office and I would open the door and I'd go into the sort of the ordered daily routine. I can remember thinking, this is fantastic, you know, this is great. And then, of course, there's been a bit of a corollary, because I'm still a mid-level administrator and I work in a university here in Dublin. Only now, of course, I've written a memoir about my time in Prague, which did indeed involve a lot of drinking, quite a lot of partying. I think there might be some sex in there as well. And I turned up to work one day and my boss had read my book. And I didn't think too much of it, except that as the weeks go by, occasionally there's references to gin, you know, and sort of little look going, "Oh, been out all night, have you?" And you think, I've got some of my class in class. There are dangers to writing a memoir if you want to return to your ordinary life. Anyway, while I was there, my first book was published, and I did the thing that you have to do when you write a book, which is I trawled from bookstore to bookstore begging people to sell it, begging them to do a launch, and with very, very little success. Until I met in Prague a guy called Miro, who was a Croatian guy. And Miro was a man of fantastic energy, unbelievable energy, and he ran this really cute little bookstore in Prague called the Big Ben Bookshop. Now, one of the things about living in Prague is nothing really works. And if you want anything to work, you really have to know how to make it work. So one of the things that was very problematic for me was, for instance, getting a visa. And I found myself quite often at 3 o'clock in the morning lining up outside the delightfully named Foreigners Police in order to beg someone to give me the bit of paper that I needed, in order to get another bit of paper, in order to get another bit of paper that I needed, before I would eventually not be granted my visa, because for some reason one of the bits of the paper had one tiny little thing wrong with it. That's the story of life in business in Prague. So when I met Miro, I was really grateful to be able to work with someone who actually knew how things worked. So this is the story of my book launch in Prague. About 3 weeks before the book launch, I received 2 letters from O2, the telecommunications company. I'd never seen anything like these letters before. They weren't bills and they weren't invoices, so it took me a bit of time with my dictionary to work out what they were. The first one turned out to be a notification telling me that I had received a telegram, and it said that in order to hear the contents of the telegram, I needed to call O2. The second one turned out to be an identical copy of the first, and you might ask yourself, as I asked myself, why they couldn't just send me the telegram. But I had accepted by this time that certain things happen in Czech bureaucracies that are not worth trying to work out or fret about. So I called the number and I spoke to a lovely woman in Czech after we had established she had no English, who told me that I had called that number because I had a telegram. "Yes, I know," I said. "Can you send it to me?" "No, we don't send telegrams." Aha. I paused, waiting for her to continue. She was silent. "Well, can you tell me what it says?" She could, and she did. She read it out in Czech, and I had trouble understanding what she was saying, but I caught the words passport and visa, so I assumed it had something to do with something pretty important. She repeated the message at my request, slowly, but eventually, after failing to make me understand its contents, she'd said she'd find someone who spoke English. That was a relief, until the English speaker got on the phone, and she told me that the telegram said that I had to provide my passport, an original power of attorney in Czech and English, my visa stamp, an original CERC form, whatever that was, in Czech and English, proof of accommodation in Prague, a copy of a bank transfer, and a pulna moc, whatever that was. And they all had to be notarised. And I have to provide these things to O2? I am sorry. Who wants these things? There was a long pause. And then she said, "You must call this number." And she gave me another number. So at this point, figuring that this had something to do with the books, I called Miro. And I said that I thought that someone with fluent Czech might be required. And could he please call the number and find out what was going on? And Miro goes, yes, I will call, we will sort this out. Because that was what Miro was like. Together we will do this. Within 2 minutes of hanging up from Miro, my phone rang, and a man in perfect English spoke to me. "Miss Weiss, you must provide these documents. I will email them to you, and then, when you have completed them, I will have someone come and pick them up." It was like magic. This was what the rich and powerful must experience all the time. People around them solving their problems, while the poor die from the stress of constantly having to work out impenetrable crap. Suddenly, a hugely complicated situation looked a lot easier, and I began to perceive that Miro was a good man to have in your corner. The nice, helpful man, who was from TNT as it turned out, the people who were bringing in the books and who'd sent me the telegram via O2, emailed me the forms. I photocopied my passport, filled in all the forms, got them translated and stamped, and he sent a courier to pick them up. A week went by. I called the nice man at TNT, Jakub was his name, just to see how it was going. I was in no rush, we had a fortnight to the launch, plenty of time. But Jakub said, awfully nicely, "Yes, Miss Weiss, there is a problem. We need the page in your passport with your entry stamp." I was getting quite good at retaining equanimity in the face of Czech administration, and so I registered not the tiniest flip of the heart or annoyance at this news. No problem. I got the passport page photocopied, and Jakub sent a courier to pick it up. A couple of days later, just to be on the safe side, now with 12 days to go, I called him to check on progress. Yes, Miss Weiss, there is another problem. We need a copy of all the entry stamps in your passport. I mean, why the Sam Hill he couldn't have called me to tell me this, I wasn't quite sure, but gritting my teeth, I photocopied the entire passport and he sent another courier. 3 days went by and I'd heard nothing. I thought perhaps I'd better phone and find out how things were going. However, when I called Jakub's number, it was answered by a woman. "Jakub? Jakub has left TNT." "I see," I said. "And my consignment?" The woman put me through to another man, Radek. He is looking after it now. The good news was that Radek spoke English, although not quite as well as Jakub, but he was just as pleasant. "And are my books coming out of customs any time soon?" "It seems my colleague did not check the paperwork well enough," said Radek ominously. "We need your address in Australia on the CERC form, not your address in Prague." "Fine," I said, trying not to sound pissy. It wasn't his fault and we still had 9 days to go. No need to panic. So I filled in another form, which Radek had kindly emailed, and another courier arrived at the door. The launch was on a Saturday. On the Monday of that week, I called Radek. "How are we going with those books?" "There is a problem with the invoice," said Radek. "The invoice does not say that the currency is Australian dollars." Really? I thought, it doesn't say Australian dollars. It does say dollars though, doesn't it? And the books have come from an Australian company with an Australian address and from an Australian port. But let's not go berserk and assume it's in Australian currency. I breathed deeply through my nose. They needed a new invoice. Rachael told me that he'd emailed Allied in Australia. And I said, well, did you actually speak to anyone? No. God damn it, why do I have to make this phone call? Why didn't you just call me? I shouted, losing my temper. He had no reply. I realised at this point that we may not have books for the launch and that this could go on forever. There was no guarantee that this was the last bit of paper these people would need, and I was having a panic attack. I know. I'll call Miro. He's done launches before. This can't be the first time this has happened. There must be some standard way of dealing with this. He will know what to do. So I called him and I explained the situation. Oh my God, said Miro. Oh my God, it's a disaster. This is a disaster. If you don't have books at their launch, you are going to have to do something really spectacular. You are going to have to dance half naked. Naked, I'm telling you. Oh my God, this isn't happening. Oh, you're going to have to be naked. I spent the next night on the phone, frantically trying to get an invoice from Allied. And then, wide awake and sweating in the early hours of Tuesday morning, I remembered that they'd sent me a long time ago an email which had an invoice in it. I'd ignored it, thinking I'd just pay the one that came with the box. I hunted it down through the depths of my inbox. And in my neatest handwriting, I put an AUD next to the $sign and raced down to Big Ben at 9 a.m. to fax it off to them. Pole dancing, shouted Miro to me. By this time, Miro and I were both calling TNT every hour on the hour. By Wednesday morning, there was still no news, but Rachael did tell us that we'd need to have them out of customs that afternoon to guarantee delivery by Saturday, because Thursday was a Czech national holiday. And then he said, you know it is handwritten, the currency. I do not know if they will accept handwriting on the invoice. It was at this point that I wondered if I was missing something culturally significant. Was it possible that at this point I should offer a bribe? You hear a lot about how everyone expects a bribe here in Prague, but quite frankly, I've never met anyone who successfully bribed an official apart from a policeman. I've met lots of people who say they know someone who have, and plenty of people who will tell you that bribery is expected. But honestly, most officials I've come across have starched beehive hairdos and a look of unassailable rectitude. But perhaps I wasn't seeing something. Look, Rachael, I said, trying to sound knowing, is there something I can do to expedite this problem? No, there is nothing you can do. Yes, perhaps I wasn't using the right code. Are you sure there's not something, something that might smooth things over? I'm sorry? Rachael sounded puzzled, as well he might. Oh, never mind. When are we going to know if it'll be released today? We will know at 2 p.m. I will call you. Well, he didn't, of course. I called him. But by this time, he wasn't taking my calls. Miro finally managed to find out that the books had not been released. We were screwed. On Friday morning, Miro called up TNT and screamed. Rachael told us that it was still possible the books might get out of customs and that we'd know at 2 o'clock. At 2 o'clock, I called him and he told me we'd know by 4 o'clock. Miro called up and screamed some more. And at 4 o'clock, on Friday afternoon, the day before the launch, miracle of miracles, Rachael said the books had cleared customs and would be sent by special delivery and that they would be at my flat by 8 o'clock at the latest. He tried to tell me that special delivery would cost extra, but I told him that if I was charged any fee, the CEO of TNT worldwide would hear about it graphically and personally. I waited on the edge of my seat while the hours passed. Finally, at 8 o'clock that Friday night, at the last possible moment, a special TNT delivery was made to my flat. 80 bottles of face cream, especially imported from France for the Hotel Leonardo. Luckily, luckily, the Hotel Leonardo had no use for 50 copies of Me, Myself and Prague, and so sent the TNT man who delivered them back to my flat, and I received the books at 10 o'clock that night. Thank you very much. Magnificently, the books almost didn't arrive for this launch as well, because spectacularly they were sent to my flat. We weren't there, and the contact number had been put on the inside of the box. So, you know, it can happen in any country. However, there are some, and don't feel obliged in the slightest, there are some at the amazingly cheap price of €10, signed over there if you would like, and of course they're right next to the wine, the really important thing. So thank you very much for coming along, and please do stay and have a drink.